The security cameras never caught her real movements. They recorded a woman pushing a mop bucket down the gleaming corridors of Fort Sterling, moving with the slow, methodical pace of someone paid by the hour rather than the mission. What that they didn't capture was how Sarah Chen memorized every face that passed her, catalogued every conversation she overheard, and counted the seconds between guard rotations with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. For 18 months, she had been invisible. Tonight, that invisibility would either save lives or get her killed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah wrung out her mop for what felt like the 1000th time that week. The suds swirled, in patterns that reminded her of tactical formations, though she pushed that thought away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah the janitor didn't think about tactical formations. Sarah the janitor thought about overtime pay and whether the coffee machine in the break room would be fixed by morning. But Sarah Chen, former Marine Corps captain with 2 tours in Afghanistan and a classified background in counterintelligence, thought about a lot more than that. The base commander's voice echoed down the hallway, pulling Sarah from her thoughts. Colonel Hayes was arguing with someone again, his voice carrying that particular edge that meant classified briefings and late-night phone calls to Washington. Sarah had learned to recognize the subtle changes in the officer's behavior patterns. When Colonel Hayes spoke in that tone, it usually meant intelligence reports that made important people nervous. Sarah continued mopping, her worn tennis shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum as she worked her way closer to the command center. The administrative staff had long since stopped noticing her presence. To them, she was part of the furniture, as permanent and unremarkable as the motivational posters on the walls or the American flag hanging in every office. The irony wasn't lost on her. 18 months ago, she had commanded respect from soldiers who would have followed her into hell. Now those same soldiers stepped around her mop bucket without making eye contact, treating her like she was barely human. The transformation had been necessary, but it still stung every time someone spoke to her like she was stupid. Dr. Rebecca Martinez emerged from the research wing, her heels clicking against the floor with the rapid staccato of someone perpetually behind schedule. The biochemist was one of the few people on base who treated Sarah with basic human decency, always offering a tired smile and asking about her day. What Dr. Martinez didn't know was that Sarah had spent the better part of a year studying her. Research, understanding the implications of her work in ways that would have surprised the brilliant scientist. Fort Sterling wasn't just any military installation. Hidden beneath the routine training exercises and administrative duties was one of the most sensitive research facilities in the country. Dr. Martinez's team was developing next-generation biological countermeasures, defensive systems that could protect American forces from biological weapons. The research was groundbreaking, revolutionary, and exactly the kind of thing that foreign governments would kill to obtain. Sarah had been placed here because intelligence agencies suspected a leak. Classified information was finding its way to hostile nations, and someone with inside access was responsible. The FBI had tried traditional investigative methods. Military intelligence had run their own operations. Everyone had failed to identify the source of the breach. So they had sent Sarah, armed with a mop bucket and a backstory that made her invisible to anyone who mattered. Captain Sarah Chen had officially died in a training accident. Sarah Chen, the janitor, had been born from paperwork and careful planning, complete with a work history at civilian facilities and references that would check out under any reasonable scrutiny. The mission parameters had been simple: observe, identify, and report. Do not engage. Do not compromise your cover. Do not take any action that would reveal your true purpose. Sarah had followed those parameters religiously for 18 months. watching and learning while everyone around her assumed she was too stupid to understand what she was seeing. Tonight, those parameters were about to become irrelevant. The first sign of trouble came at 2,147 hours, though Sarah didn't immediately recognize it as such. The perimeter guards had missed their scheduled radio check-in, but communication glitches weren't unusual. Equipment failed, people got distracted, and the duty officer would probably assume someone was taking an unauthorized smoke break. Sarah continued mopping the corridor outside the command center, listening to the duty officer try to raise the perimeter teams on the radio. The second sign was more obvious. The base's external floodlights went out in sequence, darkness spreading across Fort Sterling like spilled ink. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, muscle memory from Afghanistan reminding her that coordinated power failures usually preceded coordinated attacks. But Sarah the janitor wouldn't understand the tactical implications. Sarah the janitor would be confused, and maybe a little scared. She made herself stop mopping and look around with the bewildered expression of a civilian who didn't understand what was happening. Through the windows, she could see that the backup generators had failed to engage, leaving the base perimeter in complete darkness. That wasn't equipment failure. That was sabotage. The duty officer was no longer trying to raise the perimeter guards. He was attempting to contact the base commander, his voice taking on the clipped urgency of someone who realized the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah heard him mention the code phrase for elevated security protocols, words that would initiate lockdown procedures if the base commander confirmed the alert. Colonel Hayes never had the chance to confirm anything. The explosion that destroyed the communications array lit up the night sky like a miniature sunrise. Sarah felt the shockwave through the building structure, a deep thrumming vibration that made the windows rattle and set off car alarms in the parking lot. The lights inside the building flickered and went out, plunging the corridors into darkness, illuminated only by emergency lighting that cast everything in hellish red shadows. In the sudden silence that followed the explosion, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold. The distinctive whine of helicopter rotors approaching fast and low. Not one helicopter. Multiple aircraft, moving with the coordinated precision of a military operation. This wasn't random terrorism or opportunistic criminals. This was a professional assault, planned and executed by people who understood military tactics and had access to military equipment. The kind of people who would know exactly what Fort Sterling was hiding and exactly how to take it. Sarah dropped her mop. The janitor persona fell away like a discarded costume as 18 months of suppressed instincts reasserted themselves. She moved through the darkened building with the fluid efficiency of someone who had spent years learning to navigate hostile territory. The emergency lighting provided enough illumination to avoid obstacles, but not enough to reveal details. Sarah's night vision, honed by countless midnight patrols in Afghanistan, turned the corridors into a familiar landscape of shadows and possibilities. The helicopter sounds were getting closer. Through the windows, she could see lights moving. Across the base perimeter, too organized to be emergency responders and too fast to be anything friendly. Sarah estimated at least 3 aircraft, probably carrying a full assault team each. 40 to 60 hostiles, possibly more, all equipped with military-grade weapons and night vision equipment. The base's automated lockdown procedures had engaged. When the communications array was destroyed, sealing the main entrances and activating additional security protocols. But Sarah knew those measures were designed to keep people out, not to repel a coordinated assault by professional soldiers. The attackers would have studied the base layout, identified weaknesses, and planned countermeasures for every defensive system. Dr. Martinez appeared in the corridor ahead, her white lab coat a ghostly beacon in the red emergency lighting. The scientist was clutching a tablet computer and looking around with the confused panic of someone who had never been in a combat situation. Behind her, other research staff were emerging from their labs, voices rising in frightened questions that no one could answer. Sarah's training told her to maintain her cover, to continue playing the role of a frightened janitor until she could safely extract herself from the situation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But her conscience told her something different. These people were in mortal danger, and she was the only person in the building with the skills to do anything about it. The sound of breaking glass from the main lobby made the decision for her. Sarah ran toward Dr. Martinez, abandoning any pretense of being a scared civilian. The scientist looked surprised to see the janitor moving with such purpose, but Sarah didn't have time to explain. "Dr. Martinez," she said, her voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there moments before, "where are the classified research files?" "What?" Dr. Martinez stared at her in confusion. "Sarah, what's happening? Why are you?" Sarah grabbed the scientist's shoulders, forcing eye contact. "Dr. Martinez, I need you to listen to me very carefully. This base is under attack by people who want your research. Where are the classified files? I don't understand. You're the janitor. How do you know about classified?" The sound of automatic weapons fire erupted from the direction of the main entrance, cutting off Dr. Martinez's question. Sarah heard boots on tile, moving with the measured pace of professional soldiers, clearing a building room by room. The attackers were inside. "Dr. Martinez," Sarah said urgently, "my name is Captain Sarah Chen, United States Marine Corps. I've been working undercover here for 18 months. Right now, I'm the only thing standing between you and people who will kill you to get what they want. Where are the research files?" The scientist's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, recognition, and finally understanding. "Captain, but you mop floors, and you develop biological countermeasures that could save thousands of American lives. The attackers are here for your research, and they'll eliminate anyone who might interfere with their mission. That includes every scientist in this building." More gunfire echoed through the corridors, closer now. Sarah could hear voices shouting tactical commands in what sounded like Russian or possibly Ukrainian. Foreign military contractors, probably working for a hostile government or criminal organization with government connections. The kind of people who treated human life as an acceptable cost of doing business. "The main research servers are in the secure wing," Dr. Martinez said, her voice shaking. "But Sarah, they're behind biometric locks and encryption that would take days to break. How could anyone possibly?" "Because they have inside help," Sarah said grimly. "Someone with legitimate access is feeding them information. That's why I'm here. We suspected a leak, but we never identified the source." Dr. Martinez looked like she was about to ask another question, but Sarah held up a hand for silence. Through the building's ventilation system, she could hear movement in the floor below. The attackers were methodically clearing each level, probably working their way up to the research wing, where the most valuable information was stored. Sarah's mind raced through tactical options. The base's security forces were either dead or neutralized, leaving the research staff defenseless against a professional assault team. Local law enforcement wouldn't arrive for at least 20 minutes. Assuming they had received any distress signal before the communications array was destroyed. Federal response teams would take even longer. For the immediate future, Sarah was the only trained combatant in a building full of civilians facing an unknown number of hostile soldiers. The odds were not encouraging. But Sarah had survived. Worse odds in Afghanistan, and she had spent 18 months learning every inch of Fort Sterling's layout. The attackers might have blueprints and inside information, but Sarah had lived here. She knew which air vents connected to which rooms, which doors could be sealed from the inside, and which corridors offered the best defensive positions. More importantly, she knew that the research wing contained more than just computer servers. Dr. Martinez's team worked with chemical compounds that could be extremely dangerous in the wrong hands. Some of those compounds could also be extremely useful for someone trying to level the playing field against superior numbers. Dr. Martinez, Sarah said, I need you to take me to your laboratory. Not the main lab, your personal workspace where you keep the experimental compounds. Sarah, I can't. Those materials are classified, and some of them are dangerous. If you're really a Marine captain, you should know I can't just the lights in. The corridor suddenly blazed to life as the attackers restored power to the building. Sarah heard the hum of ventilation systems restarting and the electronic beeps of security systems coming back online. Whoever was leading the assault team knew exactly which systems to reactivate and which ones to leave disabled. Dr. Martinez, Sarah said, her voice taking on the tone she had once used to command Marines in combat. In about 5 minutes, armed soldiers are going to reach this floor. They're going to kill everyone who might be able to identify them or interfere with their mission. Your choice is simple: trust me and maybe live, or follow regulations and definitely die. The scientist stared at her for a moment, processing the transformation from invisible janitor to military officer. Finally, she nodded. My lab is this way. But Sarah, if you're really trying to help, you should know that some of the research here goes beyond biological countermeasures. There are projects that even I don't have clearance to access. What kind of projects? Dr. Martinez led her down a side corridor toward the research wing, moving with the awkward haste of someone unaccustomed to urgency. I've heard rumors. Advanced biological weapons, not just defensive systems. If that's what they're really after, Sarah stopped walking. Biological weapons? On American soil? I don't know for certain. But there have been deliveries that didn't match any project I'm aware of, and security clearances that go higher than mine. If those rumors are true, then the people attacking us might not be foreign agents. Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. She had been assuming they were dealing with foreign espionage, criminals trying to steal American research for profit or strategic advantage. But if Fort Sterling was hiding illegal weapons development, the attack might be domestic. American citizens trying to expose or steal weapons that violated international treaties. Or it might be foreign agents working with American accomplices. People with inside knowledge who had provided detailed intelligence about the base's defenses and research projects. Either way, the situation was more complex than her original mission parameters had anticipated. They reached Dr. Martinez's laboratory, a smaller space adjacent to the main research wing. The scientist used her keycard and biometric scanner to unlock the door, and they slipped inside just as the sound of boots echoed from the stairwell at the end of the corridor. The laboratory was a precisely organized chaos of equipment, chemical storage units, and computer workstations. Dr. Martinez moved to a locked cabinet and began entering an access code, her fingers shaking with adrenaline. Some of these compounds are experimental, she said quietly. I'm not sure what they'll do if they're not used properly. Sarah surveyed the laboratory, her tactical mind automatically cataloging potential weapons and defensive positions. The chemical storage units could be turned into improvised explosives or incapacitating agents. The laboratory's ventilation system connected to the rest of the building, offering potential routes for distributing compounds throughout the facility. Most importantly, the room had a secondary exit that led to a maintenance corridor, providing an escape route if their position was compromised. Dr. Martinez, how many people work in the research wing, on night shift? Maybe a dozen scientists and technicians, plus the security guards who monitor the classified areas. Are any of them trained for combat situations? Dr. Martinez gave her a look that suggested the question was absurd. They're scientists, Sarah. The most dangerous thing most of them have ever handled is a Bunsen burner. Sarah nodded, filing away the information. 12 civilians with no combat training, facing an unknown number of professional soldiers. The tactical situation was approaching hopeless, but Sarah had learned in Afghanistan that hopeless situations sometimes offered unexpected opportunities. The cabinet lock clicked open, revealing rows of carefully labeled chemical containers. Dr. Martinez pointed to several compounds, explaining their properties in rapid whispers. This one causes temporary paralysis, lasting about 30 minutes. This one creates dense smoke that's difficult to clear from enclosed spaces. And this one, Dr. Martinez hesitated, looking uncertain. What does that one do? It's a prototype incapacitating agent. We developed it for crowd control applications, but it was never tested outside the laboratory. In theory, it should cause immediate unconsciousness lasting several hours. But in theory, it could also cause permanent brain damage or death. Sarah considered the options. The paralysis agent would be useful for taking out individual targets, but it required direct contact or injection. The smoke compound could provide concealment and confusion, but it wouldn't stop armed soldiers for long. The untested incapacitating agent was a wild card that could save lives or cause a catastrophe. The sound of voices in the corridor outside made the decision urgent. Sarah could hear at least 3 different speakers, probably the advanced team checking each laboratory before the main assault force moved up to this floor. They had perhaps 2 minutes before the door would be breached. "Give me samples of all 3, Sarah said, pulling containers from the cabinet. "And Dr. Martinez? If we survive this, you and I are going to have a long conversation about what else is hidden in this facility." The scientist nodded, her face pale but determined. "Sarah, there's something else you should know. The main research servers aren't the only place the classified data is stored. There are physical backups in a secure vault beneath the building. If the attackers have inside help, they might know about those backups too." Sarah felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. A coordinated assault on multiple levels. Attackers who knew about hidden vaults and backup systems. Inside accomplices who had provided detailed intelligence. This wasn't just espionage or theft. This was a comprehensive operation designed to completely compromise Fort Sterling's research programs. Which meant the attackers weren't planning to steal the research and disappear. They were planning to destroy it, eliminating American capabilities while securing the information for themselves. And they were planning to eliminate everyone who might be able to recreate the research from memory. "Dr. Martinez," Sarah said, sealing the chemical containers in her janitor's supply bag, "I need you to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, without asking questions. Can you do that?" The scientist nodded, though her hands were still shaking. "Good, because we're about to find out whether 18 months of mopping floors was good. Preparation for fighting a war." The voices in the corridor were getting closer, and Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of tactical gear moving against fabric. Professional soldiers moving with the measured caution of people who had done this before. They would check each room systematically, leaving no hiding places uncovered and no potential threats unaddressed. Sarah positioned herself behind the laboratory door, one of the chemical containers ready in her hand. Dr. Martinez crouched behind a workstation, trying to make herself as small as possible. Through the door's small window, Sarah could see shadows moving in the corridor, backlit by the harsh fluorescent lighting. The door handle turned slowly, quietly. Whoever was about to enter had received training in room-clearing techniques, approaching with the silent efficiency of Special Forces operators. Sarah held her breath, waiting for the moment when the door would open wide enough to reveal the attackers. The door swung inward, and Sarah got her first clear look at the enemy. 3 soldiers in black tactical gear, night vision goggles pushed up on their helmets, assault rifles held in professional shooting stances. They moved with the coordinated precision of a team that had trained together extensively. Sarah recognized their equipment and tactics. These weren't foreign agents or criminal mercenaries. These were American Special Operations soldiers, possibly Army Rangers or Navy SEALs. which meant the attack on Fort Sterling wasn't foreign espionage. It was a domestic operation carried out by American military personnel against an American military installation. The implications were staggering and terrifying. Sarah waited until the lead soldier was fully inside the laboratory before she moved. 18 months of suppressed combat instincts exploded into action as she struck the container against the soldier's neck, releasing the paralysis compound directly onto his exposed skin. He dropped immediately, his nervous system shutting down. Faster than he could raise an alarm. The second soldier spun toward the sound, but Sarah was already moving. The smoke compound shattered against the doorframe, instantly filling the laboratory with dense, choking clouds that made accurate shooting impossible. Through the chaos, Sarah heard Dr. Martinez coughing and the sound of equipment being knocked over as the remaining soldiers tried to navigate the suddenly blinded environment. Sarah moved through the smoke with the advantage of someone who knew the laboratory's layout by memory. She found the second soldier by the sound of his breathing, disabling him with a chokehold that rendered him unconscious in seconds. The third soldier was calling for backup on his radio, his voice muffled by a gas mask that had protected him from the smoke compound. Sarah couldn't reach him before he completed the transmission, but she could reach his weapon. The assault rifle clattered across the laboratory floor as Sarah applied the paralysis compound to the soldier's exposed wrist. He joined his teammates in chemical unconsciousness, leaving Sarah alone with Dr. Martinez in a smoke-filled room full of neutralized enemies. But the backup was coming. Sarah could hear boots pounding up the stairwell, voices shouting tactical instructions, and the sound of equipment being moved into position. The laboratory had become a trap, and Sarah had perhaps 30 seconds before it would be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Dr. Martinez, Sarah called through the smoke, the maintenance corridor. Where's the entrance? Behind the storage units. But Sarah, how did you? Those soldiers were American, I know. Sarah's mind was racing through the implications as she helped Dr. Martinez navigate through the dissipating smoke. Which means this isn't foreign espionage. This is something much worse. They reached the maintenance entrance just as the laboratory door exploded inward under the impact of a breaching charge. Sarah pushed Dr. Martinez into the narrow corridor and followed her, sealing the access panel behind them. The maintenance corridor was cramped and poorly lit, but it connected to the building's service areas and provided routes that wouldn't appear on standard architectural blueprints. As they crawled through the confined space, Sarah tried to process what she had witnessed. American Special Operations soldiers attacking an American military research facility. Inside, accomplices who had provided detailed intelligence about the base's defenses and layout. A coordinated operation designed to eliminate witnesses and secure classified research. This wasn't espionage. This was a coup, carried out by elements within the American military against their own government. The research at Fort Sterling was apparently valuable enough that someone was willing to commit treason to control it. Behind them, Sarah could hear voices echoing through the laboratory as the attackers discovered their neutralized teammates. The paralysis compound would keep those soldiers unconscious for several hours, but their equipment and communication gear would provide valuable intelligence about the scope of the operation. Dr. Martinez, Sarah whispered as they reached a junction. In the maintenance system, I need you to think very carefully. Who else knows about the backup vault you mentioned? Who has access to that information? Only a few people. The base commander, the research director, maybe 3 or 4 senior scientists. And the security company that installed the vault system. What security company? Blackwater Solutions. They handle all the classified infrastructure here. But Sarah, they're a reputable firm with government contracts all over the country. Sarah felt the pieces of the conspiracy falling into place. A private security company with access to classified facilities across the military and intelligence communities. Employees who could move freely through secure installations without raising suspicion. Personnel with detailed knowledge of defensive systems and emergency protocols. Blackwater Solutions wasn't just providing security services. They were providing intelligence to hostile forces, using their legitimate access to gather information. That would enable coordinated attacks on American facilities. The assault on Fort Sterling was probably just one operation in a larger campaign against American research and development programs. Dr. Martinez, how many other facilities use Blackwater for security services? I don't know exactly, but I've heard they work at laboratories and bases all over the country. Research facilities, weapons development programs, intelligence installations. Sarah realized they weren't just dealing with an attack on Fort Sterling. They were potentially dealing with a coordinated assault on America's entire classified research infrastructure. Foreign agents and domestic traders working together to steal or destroy decades of military and scientific development. The maintenance corridor opened into a larger service area that housed the building's mechanical systems. Sarah could hear the hum of ventilation equipment and the distant sound of emergency generators providing power to critical systems. More importantly, she could hear voices echoing through the building's structure as the attackers spread throughout the facility. They were running out of time. The assault team would soon realize that their targets had escaped through the maintenance system, and they would begin coordinated sweeps of all possible hiding places. Sarah and Dr. Martinez needed to reach the backup vault before the attackers could complete their mission. But first, Sarah needed to understand exactly what they were trying to protect. Dr. Martinez, she said as they moved through the mechanical area, I need you to tell me everything about the research being conducted here, not just your work, everything you know or suspect about the classified projects. The scientist looked reluctant to violate security protocols, but the sound of explosions from above reminded her that normal protocols no longer applied. There are at least 6 different research programs operating out of Fort Sterling, she sighed quietly. My team works on biological countermeasures, defensive systems to protect against biological weapons. But there are other teams working on projects I don't have clearance to access. What kind of projects? Advanced biological weapons, possibly including agents that could target specific genetic markers. Psychological warfare compounds that could incapacitate enemy forces without killing them. And something called Project Nightfall that requires clearances so high that even mentioning it could be considered treason. Sarah stopped walking. Biological weapons that could target genetic markers meant weapons designed to kill people based on their ethnic background. Psychological warfare compounds could be used against civilian populations as well as military targets. And Project Nightfall sounded like something that belonged in science fiction rather than legitimate research. Dr. Martinez, if this research fell into the wrong hands, what would be the worst-case scenario? The scientist was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. Genocide, she said finally. Weapons that could eliminate entire ethnic groups while leaving others unharmed. Compounds that could render entire populations helpless or compliant. And if Project Nightfall involves what I think it involves, weapons that could rewrite human biology at the genetic level. Sarah felt sick. The research at Fort Sterling wasn't just classified. It was potentially the most dangerous collection of biological weapons ever developed. No wonder someone was willing to commit treason to obtain it. In the wrong hands, these weapons could reshape human civilization or end it entirely. Which meant Sarah's mission had just evolved from protecting classified research to preventing global catastrophe. They reached another access point that led back into the main building, this one opening near the secure wing where the backup vault was located. Through the access panel, Sarah could see the corridor beyond, dimly lit by emergency lighting and apparently empty. But appearances could be deceiving, especially when dealing with professional soldiers who understood concealment and ambush tactics. Dr. Martinez, Sarah whispered, "When we go through that door, stay behind me and move exactly where I move." These people are trained killers, and they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who interferes with their mission. The scientist nodded, her face pale but determined. "Sarah, what happens if we can't stop them? What happens if they get the research?" Then Sarah said grimly, "We hope that whoever they're working for has enough conscience left to understand what they're unleashing." Sarah opened the access panel slowly, scanning the corridor beyond for any sign of hostile presence. The secure wing was supposed to be the most protected area of the facility, but the attackers had already demonstrated their ability to bypass or neutralize the base's defensive systems. The corridor appeared empty, but Sarah's instincts told her they were being watched. Somewhere in the shadows, hostile eyes were tracking their movements, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. The question was whether Sarah could reach the backup vault before that moment arrived. She led Dr. Martinez into the corridor, moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate hostile territory without getting killed. Every shadow could hide an enemy, every sound could signal an ambush, and every step could be their last. Behind them, the sounds of the assault continued to echo through the building. The attackers were methodically clearing each area, eliminating resistance and securing their objectives with professional efficiency. Soon, they would reach the secure wing, and Sarah's tactical advantage would disappear. The backup vault was located behind multiple layers of security, including biometric scanners, encryption locks, and physical barriers designed to withstand military-grade explosives. Under normal circumstances, it would take hours or days to breach those defenses. But if the attackers had inside help, they might have the access codes and override procedures needed to open the vault in minutes. Dr. Martinez led her to a seemingly blank section of wall that concealed the vault entrance. The biometric scanner activated when they approached, bathing their faces in red laser light as it verified their identities. Sarah held her breath, hoping that her cover identity hadn't been blown completely, that some trace of her legitimate access remained in the system. The scanner beeped softly, and the wall section slid aside to reveal an airlock-style entrance. They were through the first layer of security, but Sarah knew there would be additional checkpoints inside the vault itself. As they entered the airlock, Sarah heard footsteps in the corridor behind them. The attackers had reached the secure wing, and they were moving with the purposeful stride of people who knew exactly where they were going. Sarah and Dr. Martinez had perhaps 2 minutes before their hiding place would be discovered. The inner door of the airlock opened to reveal a room that looked more like a bank vault than a research facility. Steel walls, reinforced concrete floors, and rows of secure storage units that contained backups of every classified project at Fort Sterling, including, Sarah realized with growing horror, the research that could end human civilization if it fell into the wrong hands. Dr. Martinez moved to a control panel and began entering access codes, her fingers flying over the keypad as she tried to secure or destroy the stored data before the attackers could reach it. But the process was taking too long, and Sarah could hear voices approaching the vault entrance. They had run out of time. Sarah positioned herself at the vault entrance, preparing for what would probably be her final fight. She had 3 chemical containers left, a tactical knife she had taken from one of the paralyzed soldiers, and 18 months of suppressed rage at being underestimated and dismissed. It would have to be enough. The airlock began to cycle open, and Sarah could see figures in tactical gear preparing to breach the vault. Professional soldiers with military-grade weapons, night vision equipment, and the tactical advantage of superior numbers. Under normal circumstances, Sarah would have no chance of survival. But these weren't normal circumstances. And Sarah Chen, former Marine captain, wasn't planning to go down without a fight. She thought about the 18 months she had spent. Invisible, dismissed as just another janitor mopping floors and emptying trash cans. She thought about the people who had treated her like she was stupid, worthless, beneath their notice. And she thought about the research stored in this vault, weapons that could end civilization if they fell into the wrong hands. As the first attacker entered the vault, Sarah smiled. For 18 months, she had been invisible. Tonight, she was going to remind everyone exactly why invisibility could be the most dangerous weapon of all. The first soldier through the airlock never saw Sarah coming. 18 months of being invisible had taught her to move through spaces like she belonged there, and the darkness of the vault worked in her favor. Her knife found the gap between his tactical vest and helmet, dropping him silently before his teammates realized the threat. The second attacker spun toward the sound, but Sarah was already rolling behind a storage unit. The incapacitating agent shattered against his face mask, and even through the protective equipment, enough of the compound penetrated to send him crashing into the vault wall. Sarah hoped Dr. Martinez had been right about the 30-minute unconsciousness estimate, because permanent brain damage would complicate her already impossible situation. 3 more soldiers poured through the airlock, their weapons sweeping the vault with practiced precision. Sarah pressed herself against the floor behind the storage units, counting muzzle flashes and tracking their movement patterns. These weren't the same soldiers she had encountered in the laboratory. This team moved with even greater coordination, suggesting they were elite operators with extensive combat experience. Dr. Martinez was still working at the control panel, her fingers flying over the interface as she tried to initiate the vault's emergency destruction protocols. The stored research data could be completely erased in minutes, but only if she could maintain access long enough to complete the sequence. Every second she remained exposed increased the probability that a stray bullet would end both their lives and leave the biological weapons research in hostile hands. Sarah's tactical assessment was grim. 5 attackers neutralized, but unknown numbers still active throughout the facility. Limited ammunition and chemical agents. No backup coming. 1 civilian to protect while preventing weapons of mass destruction from falling into the wrong hands. The mission parameters had shifted from intelligence gathering to last stand defense, and Sarah's training hadn't covered scenarios quite this hopeless. The team leader made hand signals to his remaining soldiers, coordinating a systematic sweep of the vault. They moved with the mechanical efficiency of people who had cleared hostile rooms hundreds of times, covering each other's movements and eliminating blind spots with professional precision. Sarah realized she was facing special operations soldiers who had probably fought in the same theaters where she had earned her combat experience. The irony wasn't lost on her. American soldiers trained to protect their country were now attacking an American facility to steal weapons that could destroy civilization. Whatever force had corrupted them represented a threat that transcended national boundaries and military loyalties. Sarah waited until the soldiers were committed to their sweep pattern before moving. The smoke compound detonated near the airlock, instantly filling the vault with dense clouds that turned the enclosed space into a maze of confusion. Through the chaos, she heard voices calling tactical instructions in calm, professional tones. These soldiers had been trained to operate in degraded visibility conditions. But Sarah had learned to fight in Afghan caves where darkness was absolute, and every sound could mean death. She moved through the smoke like a predator in familiar territory, using the vault's acoustic properties to track her targets by breathing patterns and equipment noise. The first soldier went down to a chokehold. Applied from behind, his unconscious body lowered silently to the floor. The second soldier detected her approach and spun with his weapon ready, but Sarah's knife was already moving. The blade found the gap in his tactical gear, and he joined his teammate in chemical unconsciousness. 2 down, 1 still active, but Sarah could hear additional voices outside the vault. Reinforcements were coming. Dr. Martinez's voice cut through the dissipating smoke. Sarah, the destruction sequence is armed, but I need 90 seconds to complete the upload. The backup drives have to sync with the main servers before the data can be permanently erased. 90 seconds might as well have been 90 hours. Sarah could hear boots pounding down the corridor outside, voices coordinating assault positions, and the distinctive sound of heavier weapons being moved into place. The remaining team leader was calling for backup and probably requesting explosives to breach the vault if conventional assault tactics failed. Sarah positioned herself between Dr. Martinez and the airlock, preparing for what would certainly be her final engagement. She had one chemical container left, a knife with a chipped blade, and the tactical advantages of knowing the vault layout and having nothing left to lose. Against professional soldiers with military-grade weapons and numerical superiority, those advantages felt pathetically inadequate. The team leader appeared in the airlock entrance, moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to respect unseen enemies. His weapon swept the vault in a methodical pattern, searching for targets through the clearing smoke. When his gaze reached Sarah's position, their eyes met across the storage units. For a moment, neither moved. The soldier was evaluating a new tactical situation, recalculating his approach based on the evidence of his neutralized teammates. Sarah was studying his equipment and positioning, looking for any weakness she could exploit in what would probably be her last 30 seconds of life. Then recognition dawned in the soldier's eyes, and Sarah realized her cover identity had been completely blown. This wasn't just any special operations soldier. This was someone who knew exactly who she was and why she was at Fort Sterling. "Captain Sarah Chen," the soldier said, his voice carrying clearly through the vault. "The legendary Marine who died in a training accident 18 months ago. Except you didn't die, did you? You went underground, became invisible, infiltrated this facility to investigate suspected security breaches." Sarah kept her weapon ready but didn't move from her defensive position. "You seem to know a lot about classified operations for someone who's supposed to be on the same side." The soldier's laugh was bitter. "The same side? Captain, there are no sides anymore. Just competing interests, and the people smart enough to position themselves advantageously. Your investigation threatened to expose a very profitable arrangement. So arrangements were made to eliminate the threat." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach as the implications became clear. The attack on Fort Sterling wasn't foreign espionage or domestic terrorism. It was a business operation, carried out by American military personnel who had decided that profit was more important than patriotism. The biological weapons research was being stolen not to serve foreign governments, but to serve the highest bidder in a global marketplace, where human life was just another commodity. Dr. Martinez's voice carried from the control panel. 60 seconds, Sarah. I need 60 more seconds." The soldier heard her and shifted his weapon toward the scientist. "Dr. Martinez has been very helpful in our research acquisition program. Her expertise will be valuable to our clients, assuming she survives the transition period." Sarah moved before the soldier could complete his aim, throwing herself between his weapon and Dr. Martinez. The assault rifle's muzzle flash lit up the vault like strobing lightning as Sarah rolled behind another storage unit. Bullets sparked off metal surfaces and punched through steel with the distinctive whine of military-grade ammunition. But Sarah was already moving again, using the vault's layout to stay ahead of the soldier's targeting solutions. The final chemical container shattered against the wall near his position, releasing the remaining paralysis compound in a cloud that would hopefully slow his reactions, even if it didn't incapacitate him completely. The soldier's breathing changed, becoming labored as the compound affected his nervous system. His weapon tracking became less precise, his movements less coordinated. Sarah pressed her advantage, closing the distance between them with the fluid efficiency of someone who had learned hand-to-hand combat in situations where hesitation meant death. The fight was brief and brutal. The soldier was larger and better armed, but the chemical compound had disrupted his coordination enough to level the playing field. Sarah's knife found its target, and another enemy joined his teammates in unconsciousness. But victory came at a cost. Sarah could hear voices echoing through the corridor outside, tactical instructions being shouted with increasing urgency. The assault team was preparing for a final push, probably with heavy explosives that would breach the vault regardless of its defensive capabilities. Dr. Martinez's voice was tight with concentration. 30 seconds, Sarah. The upload is almost complete. Sarah positioned herself at the airlock entrance, scanning the corridor beyond for any sign of the incoming assault. Through the facility's communication system, she could hear radio chatter coordinating the attack. Multiple teams converging on the vault, heavy weapons being positioned, and someone in command authority authorizing the use of explosive charges. 20 seconds. Sarah's earpiece, taken from one of the neutralized soldiers, crackled with incoming communications. The voice was crisp, professional, and completely familiar. Sarah's blood ran cold as she recognized the speaker. Colonel Hayes, the base commander who had been arguing about classified briefings earlier that evening. The man responsible for Fort Sterling's security was coordinating the attack against his own facility. All teams, this is command. Target acquisition is complete. Dr. Martinez's research has been secured, and Captain Chen has been neutralized. Prepare for facility sterilization in 60 seconds. Sarah realized the scope of the betrayal was even larger than she had imagined. This wasn't just corrupt soldiers stealing research for profit. This was a coordinated operation involving the base's command structure, designed to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence while making the theft appear to be a terrorist attack. 10 seconds. The upload completion tone chimed through the vault, and Dr. Martinez stepped back from the control panel with obvious relief. The data is destroyed, she said. Every backup, every research file, every trace of the biological weapons programs. It's gone. Sarah felt a moment of satisfaction before the reality of their situation reasserted itself. The research might be destroyed, but they were still trapped in a vault beneath a military facility controlled by traitors who planned to eliminate all witnesses. Destroying the data had been a victory, but it might also have been a pointless gesture if they didn't survive to report what they had discovered. The corridor outside suddenly filled with smoke and the thunder of approaching boots. Multiple assault teams were converging on the vault, moving with the coordinated precision of a final push. Sarah could hear equipment being set up outside. The airlock, probably shaped charges designed to breach the vault's defensive barriers. Dr. Martinez moved to stand beside her, clutching a small device that Sarah recognized as an emergency beacon. "If we don't make it out of here," she said quietly, "this contains everything I know about the conspiracy. Names, dates, financial records, proof that the biological weapons research was being sold to foreign buyers." Sarah took the device, feeling its weight like a lifeline. The proof of treason and crimes against humanity, condensed into a device smaller than a cell phone. If they could somehow get the beacon to legitimate authorities, the conspiracy could be exposed even if they didn't survive to testify. But first, they had to survive the next 5 minutes. The shaped charges detonated with a sound like thunder in an enclosed space. The vault's outer barriers held, but Sarah could see stress fractures spreading through the steel walls. The attackers had enough explosives to breach any defensive system, and they were prepared to use them regardless of the risk to the facility's structural integrity. Sarah's radio crackled again with Colonel Hayes' voice. "Phase 3 is authorized. Facility destruction will commence in 10 minutes. All personnel evacuate to minimum safe distance." Facility destruction meant demolishing Fort Sterling completely, eliminating all evidence of the conspiracy while making the attack appear to be a terrorist operation that had gotten out of control. Everyone inside the facility would be listed as casualties of the attack, their deaths blamed on foreign agents or domestic terrorists rather than corrupt military personnel. Sarah realized they weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting to expose a conspiracy that threatened to undermine the entire American military establishment. If Colonel Hayes and his accomplices succeeded, they would have demonstrated that American military installations could be attacked and destroyed by their own personnel without consequences. The second wave of explosions was stronger, and Sarah could see daylight through cracks in the vault walls. The attackers were using enough force to bring down the entire building, converging their commitment to eliminating all witnesses and evidence. In minutes, Fort Sterling would be rubble, and the truth about the biological weapons conspiracy would be buried, along with everyone who knew about it. Dr. Martinez grabbed Sarah's arm. "There's another way out," she said urgently. "The vault system connects to an emergency tunnel that leads to the old missile silos. It was built during the Cold War as an escape route for essential personnel." Sarah followed the scientist to what appeared to be a solid wall at the back of the vault. Dr. Martinez pressed her hand against a concealed panel, and a section of the wall slid aside to reveal a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness. The passage was barely wide enough for one person, with rough concrete walls that showed the age of its construction. As they entered the tunnel, Sarah could hear the final assault beginning behind them. The vault's remaining defenses were being systematically destroyed, and soon the attackers would discover their escape route. But the tunnel offered hope, a chance to reach the surface with the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy. The passage sloped upward at a steep angle, forcing them to climb rather than walk. Sarah's muscles, conditioned by 18 months of physical labor, handled the exertion easily. Dr. Martinez struggled more, her breathing becoming labored as they ascended. Through the darkness behind them, the sound of explosions grew more distant but more frequent. Colonel Hayes was following through on his threat to destroy the facility, using enough force to ensure that nothing recognizable would remain. Anyone investigating the attack would find only rubble and bodies, with no evidence of the true perpetrators or their motives. The tunnel ended at another concealed entrance, this one leading into an abandoned missile silo that dated to the 1960s. Sarah recognized the architecture from her military history training, the reinforced concrete and steel construction designed to survive nuclear attack. The silo had been decommissioned decades ago, but the emergency tunnel connection suggested it still served some classified purpose. They emerged into the silo's control room, a space filled with outdated equipment and covered in dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. Through the silo's observation windows, Sarah could see Fort Sterling in the distance, illuminated by fires and explosions as Colonel Hayes' demolition program continued. Dr. Martinez activated her emergency beacon, sending a coded signal that would hopefully reach legitimate authorities before the conspiracy could intercept and suppress it. The message would include her research data, evidence of the biological weapons programs, and proof of the military personnel involved in the conspiracy. But Sarah knew that sending the signal was only the first step. They still had to survive long enough for the authorities to respond, and Colonel Hayes would certainly have contingency plans for eliminating witnesses who escaped the facility destruction. As if summoned by her thoughts, the silo's communication system activated with an incoming message. The voice was Colonel Hayes, speaking with the calm authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "Captain Chen, I know you're listening. The facility destruction is proceeding on schedule, and all evidence of tonight's activities will be eliminated shortly. You have one opportunity to survive this situation." Sarah picked up the communication handset, curiosity overcoming caution. "What kind of opportunity, Colonel?" "Surrender Dr. Martinez and the research data you've stolen. Return to Fort Sterling and allow yourself to be listed among the casualties of tonight's terrorist attack. In exchange, you'll be relocated with a new identity and sufficient resources to live comfortably for the rest of your life." Sarah looked at Dr. Martinez, who was shaking her head emphatically while monitoring the beacon's transmission status. The scientist had risked everything to prevent biological weapons from falling into the wrong hands, and she wasn't about to compromise now. And if I refuse? Sarah asked. Then you'll be hunted by people with unlimited resources and government connections. Every law enforcement agency, every intelligence service, every military unit in the country will be looking for the terrorist who attacked Fort Sterling and stole classified research. You'll spend the rest of your life running, and eventually, you'll be caught. Sarah considered the offer, weighing the colonel's words against everything she had learned about the conspiracy. Colonel Hayes and his accomplices had demonstrated their willingness to commit treason, murder, and crimes against humanity for profit. Trusting them with her life would be suicidal stupidity. Colonel, she said finally, I have a counteroffer. Surrender yourself to federal authorities, confess your crimes, and provide information about every person and organization involved in this conspiracy. In exchange, I'll recommend that you be housed in protective custody rather than general population when you're sent to prison. The colonel's laugh carried clearly through the communication system. Captain, you still don't understand the scope of what you're facing. This operation involves personnel at every level of the military and intelligence communities. The people you think of as legitimate authorities are the same people who authorized and funded the biological weapons research. Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach as the implications became clear. The conspiracy wasn't limited to Fort Sterling or even to the military. It involved government officials, intelligence agencies, and probably private contractors who had transformed national defense into a profit center, where human life was merely another commodity to be bought and sold. Dr. Martinez's beacon chimed softly, indicating that the transmission had been completed successfully. The evidence was now in the hands of whoever monitored emergency channels, hopefully including people who weren't part of the conspiracy. But Sarah realized that even legitimate authorities might have difficulty distinguishing between actual evidence and sophisticated disinformation. The colonel's voice continued through the communication system. You have 5 minutes to consider my offer, Captain. After that, the facility destruction will be complete and cleanup operations will begin. I'd prefer to resolve the situation quietly, but I'm prepared to escalate if necessary. Sarah understood the threat. Colonel Hayes had access to military resources that could track them anywhere they tried to hide. Satellite surveillance, communication intercepts, database searches that could identify every person they contacted for help. Running would only delay the inevitable confrontation. But Sarah had learned something during her 18 months of being invisible. Sometimes the best strategy wasn't to run or hide. Sometimes the best strategy was to attack when your enemies least expected it. Dr. Martinez, she said quietly, how long before legitimate authorities receive and analyze your beacon transmission? The scientist checked her device. The automated system should forward it to the FBI, CIA, and Pentagon within the hour. But Sarah, if the conspiracy involves people in those agencies, the evidence might be suppressed or discredited. Sarah nodded, understanding the problem. They needed to ensure that the evidence reached people who couldn't be bought, threatened, or eliminated by the conspiracy. People with the authority and resources to conduct an investigation that couldn't be suppressed through official channels. The solution came to her with the clarity of desperation. They didn't need to convince government officials who might be corrupt. They needed to convince the American people who would demand justice once they understood the scope of the betrayal. Dr. Martinez, does your beacon have the capability to transmit to civilian communication networks? News organizations, internet servers, social media platforms? The scientist's eyes widened as she understood Sarah's plan. The emergency beacon is designed to reach any available communication network. If I modify the transmission protocols, I could broadcast the evidence to every major news organization in the country simultaneously. Do it, Sarah said. Make sure the transmission includes everything about the biological weapons research, the conspiracy, the attack on Fort Sterling. and Colonel Hayes's involvement. When this story breaks, it will be too big for anyone to suppress or discredit. As Dr. Martinez worked on modifying the beacon, Sarah monitored the communication system for any indication of incoming threats. Through the silo's observation windows, she could see helicopters circling the remains of Fort Sterling, probably searching for survivors or escaped personnel. The facility destruction was nearly complete, leaving only scattered fires and rubble where a secret research installation had operated for years. The colonel's voice returned to the communication system, carrying a tone of increased urgency. "Captain Chen, your time is up. I'm dispatching search teams to your location. Surrender now, and you'll be treated as a prisoner of war rather than a terrorist." Sarah picked up the handset one final time. "Colonel Hayes, I have a message for you and everyone involved in this conspiracy. You made one critical mistake when you decided to attack Fort Sterling." "What mistake is that, Captain?" "You assumed that a janitor couldn't fight back. Tonight, you're going to learn exactly how wrong that assumption was." Sarah disconnected the communication system and turned to Dr. Martinez. "How long until the broadcast transmission is ready?" 2 minutes, the scientist replied, her fingers flying over the beacon's interface. "But Sarah, once we send this, there's no going back. We'll be fugitives until someone with legitimate authority can sort out the truth." Sarah checked her remaining equipment. One damaged knife, empty chemical containers, and tactical gear taken from neutralized enemies. Not much for fighting off professional soldiers with air support and unlimited resources. But she had survived. Worse odds in Afghanistan, and she had something now that she hadn't possessed then: absolute moral clarity about who the enemy was and what needed to be done. "The transmission is ready," Dr. Martinez announced. "Once I activate this, every major news organization in the country will have complete evidence of the conspiracy. There won't be any way to suppress or discredit the story." Sarah positioned herself at the silo entrance, scanning the horizon for signs of approaching search teams. In the distance, she could see lights moving across the landscape, probably ground vehicles coordinating with the helicopters overhead. Colonel Hayes was deploying significant resources to eliminate the witnesses and recover the evidence. "Activate the transmission," Sarah said. "Let's show the world what happens when patriots are betrayed by the people they trusted to protect them." The beacon chimed softly as the transmission began, uploading terabytes of classified data to news servers across the country. Within minutes, investigative journalists would be reviewing evidence of biological weapons programs, military conspiracies, and crimes against humanity committed by people who had sworn oaths to defend the Constitution. As the upload completed, Sarah felt a moment of satisfaction. Regardless of what happened to her and Dr. Martinez, the truth would survive. The conspiracy would be exposed, the guilty would face justice, and the biological weapons research would remain destroyed. But their immediate situation remained desperate. Search teams were approaching the silo, and Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of military vehicles and aircraft coordinating an assault. Colonel Hayes was apparently willing to use whatever force was necessary to eliminate the remaining witnesses. Dr. Martinez joined her at the silo entrance, clutching a backup storage device that contained additional evidence. "If we don't survive this," she said quietly, "at least we've given the truth a chance." Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar calm that had carried her through countless dangerous situations. "Dr. Martinez, we're not just going to survive this. We're going to make sure that everyone involved in this conspiracy faces the consequences of their actions." The first helicopter appeared over the horizon, its searchlight sweeping the landscape as it approached the abandoned missile silo. Behind it, Sarah could see additional aircraft and the lights of ground vehicles converging on their position. Colonel Hayes had committed significant resources to this operation, suggesting that the stakes were even higher than she had realized. But Sarah had learned something important during her 18 months of being invisible and underestimated. The most dangerous enemies were often the ones who looked most harmless. And she was about to remind Colonel Hayes and his conspirators that a janitor who had spent 18 months learning their secrets could be the most dangerous enemy of all. As the helicopters approached, Sarah checked her equipment one final time and prepared for what would either be her greatest victory or her final battle. Either way, the world would soon know the truth about Fort Sterling, and the people responsible for betraying their country would face the judgment they deserved. The cleaning lady was about to show them exactly how dangerous an invisible woman could be when she decided to become visible. The helicopter's searchlight swept across the missile silo like a mechanical eye, probing for any sign of movement. In the abandoned structure, Sarah pressed herself against the concrete wall, counting the aircraft approaching their position. 3 helicopters, coordinated ground vehicles, and what sounded like at least 50 personnel converging on the old Cold War installation. Colonel Hayes was taking no chances with loose ends. Dr. Martinez crouched beside her, clutching the backup evidence device like a lifeline. Through the silo's cracked observation windows, they could see the news transmission completing its upload to servers across the nation. Within hours, investigative journalists would be analyzing proof of biological weapons programs, military conspiracies, and treason committed at the highest levels of command. But surviving long enough to see justice served would require more than transmitted evidence. Sarah evaluated their tactical situation with the cold precision of someone who had faced impossible odds before. Limited weapons, no backup, surrounded by hostile forces with air support and numerical superiority. The kind of scenario that military academies used to teach the concept of acceptable losses. Except Sarah had never accepted the concept of acceptable losses when those losses included innocent lives and national security. The first assault team rappelled from the lead helicopter, black-clad figures descending with mechanical precision onto the silo's concrete platform. Sarah recognized their equipment and movement patterns as elite special operations personnel, probably the same units that had attacked Fort Sterling. Soldiers trained to protect America, now serving private interests that treated patriotism as a marketable commodity. Colonel Hayes's voice crackled through portable speakers mounted on the approaching vehicles. "Captain Chen, Dr. Martinez, you've demonstrated admirable resourcefulness. But this situation has escalated beyond your ability to influence. Surrender now, and I guarantee you'll be treated according to military conventions." Sarah almost laughed at the irony. Military conventions from a man who had just orchestrated the destruction of an American military facility to cover up the theft of biological weapons. Colonel Hayes had abandoned every principle of military service except the tactical ones that helped him eliminate witnesses to his crimes. Dr. Martinez activated her emergency beacon one final time, transmitting their exact coordinates to every federal agency monitoring emergency frequencies. If legitimate authorities existed within the government, they would know where to find the evidence and the witnesses. If such authorities didn't exist, then the country Sarah had served was already lost to corruption too deep for individual action to remedy. The assault teams moved with coordinated precision, establishing perimeter positions while maintaining clear fields of fire toward the silo entrance. These soldiers understood siege tactics and built-in clearance procedures, suggesting they intended to take prisoners rather than simply eliminate threats. Sarah realized Colonel Hayes wanted them alive, probably to recover any evidence they might have hidden and to ensure no additional witnesses survived. That tactical mistake would cost him everything. Sarah studied the silo's internal layout, identifying defensive positions and potential escape routes with the systematic thoroughness that had kept her alive through multiple combat deployments. The structure had been designed to survive nuclear attack with reinforced walls and multiple levels connected by maintenance passages. Most importantly, the silo contained equipment and materials that could be converted into weapons by someone with the right knowledge and sufficient desperation. Dr. Martinez followed her deeper into the silo, moving carefully through passages filled with decades of accumulated dust and abandoned machinery. The Cold War-era installation contained communication equipment, power systems, and chemical storage tanks that had been forgotten by everyone except the engineers who maintained the emergency tunnel connections. Sarah found what she was looking for in the silo's lower levels, a fuel storage area that contained several hundred gallons of rocket propellant in various stages of chemical degradation. The compounds were supposedly inert after decades of storage, but Sarah's chemistry knowledge suggested they could be reactivated under the right conditions. Combined with the silo's ventilation system and electrical infrastructure, the fuel storage represented enough potential energy to level everything within a quarter-mile radius. Dr. Martinez understood immediately when Sarah explained the improvised weapon. "If we trigger an explosion that large," she whispered, "it won't just eliminate the assault teams. It could kill us and anyone within miles of this location." Sarah nodded grimly. "That's why we're going to give Colonel Hayes and his people one final opportunity to surrender and face justice through legitimate channels. If they refuse, then we'll demonstrate the consequences of betraying the principles they swore to defend." The fuel system required manual activation through a sequence of valves and electrical connections that would take several minutes to complete. Sarah began the process while Dr. Martinez monitored the assault teams approach through the silo surveillance systems. The soldiers were moving methodically, checking each level and room with professional thoroughness. They would reach the lower levels within 10 minutes. Sarah's earpiece, taken from one of the neutralized soldiers at Fort Sterling, crackled with tactical communications as the assault teams coordinated their movements. The conversations revealed operational details that confirmed her worst suspicions about the conspiracy. References to overseas buyers, shipping schedules for biological materials, and financial transfers that involved amounts large enough to fund small wars. Colonel Hayes wasn't just stealing research for profit. He was operating a comprehensive program that sold American military secrets, biological weapons, and strategic intelligence to the highest bidders regardless of their intentions or affiliations. Fort Sterling had been one facility in a network that treated national security as inventory in a global marketplace, where human life was measured in dollars rather than dignity. Dr. Martinez's monitoring equipment detected movement in the upper levels as the assault teams began their systematic descent. 3 teams of 6 soldiers each, armed with non-lethal weapons designed to incapacitate rather than kill. Colonel Hayes definitely wanted prisoners, probably to extract information about any additional evidence or witnesses before arranging permanent solutions to his security problems. Sarah completed the fuel system activation sequence and established a remote detonation capability using components from the silo's emergency systems. The improvised weapon would respond to radio signals transmitted on specific frequencies, giving her the ability to trigger the explosion from a safe distance if negotiations failed. But Sarah hoped negotiations wouldn't fail. Despite everything Colonel Hayes had done, despite his betrayal of every principal military service represented, she still believed in the possibility of justice through legitimate channels. The evidence Dr. Martinez had transmitted would reach people with the authority and integrity to investigate the conspiracy, arrest the guilty parties, and restore accountability to institutions that had been corrupted by greed. She activated the silo's communication system and transmitted on the 5 frequency Colonel Hayes had been using to coordinate the assault. "Colonel, this is Captain Chen. I'm requesting a ceasefire and an opportunity to discuss terms for our surrender." The response came immediately, Colonel Hayes' voice carrying obvious relief. "Captain, I'm pleased you've decided to approach this situation rationally. What terms are you proposing?" "Complete amnesty for Dr. Martinez in exchange for her cooperation with a legitimate federal investigation." Protective custody for both of us until the conspiracy can be exposed and the guilty parties prosecuted. And immediate notification of the FBI, CIA, and Pentagon that witnesses are available to testify about biological weapons programs and military corruption. There was a long pause before Colonel Hayes responded. Captain, I think you misunderstand the nature of our situation. The biological weapons programs were authorized at the highest levels of government. The research you're trying to expose was conducted with full knowledge and approval of the agencies you want to contact. Sarah felt her last hope for institutional justice crumble as the colonel's words confirmed her worst fears. The conspiracy wasn't limited to corrupt military personnel or private contractors. It involved government officials who had authorized the development of weapons banned by international treaties, using American tax dollars to fund research that violated every principle of human decency. Colonel Hayes continued, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a confused child. The buyers you're concerned about include allied governments, intelligence agencies, and private security firms that serve American interests overseas. This isn't treason, Captain. It's foreign policy conducted through unofficial channels. Sarah looked at Dr. Martinez, who was shaking her head with expressions of disgust and disbelief. The scientist had devoted her career to developing defensive countermeasures that would protect American soldiers from biological weapons. Learning that her research had been perverted into offensive weapons sold to foreign buyers represented a betrayal of everything she had worked to accomplish. Colonel, Sarah said into the communication system, you're asking me to believe that selling biological weapons to foreign buyers serves American interests. You're asking me to accept that attacking an American military facility and murdering American personnel represents legitimate foreign policy. Sometimes the greater good requires actions that appear questionable when viewed from limited perspectives. The colonel replied, the profits from these operations fund intelligence activities that Congress would never approve through official channels. The research provides defensive capabilities that protect American forces from threats they don't even know exist. Sarah realized she was listening to the rationalization of someone who had convinced himself that personal profit and national interest were identical concepts. Colonel Hayes had transformed patriotism into a business model where loyalty could be bought and sold like any other commodity. The biological weapons programs weren't serving American interests. They were serving the financial interests of people who had learned to profit from chaos and suffering. Dr. Martinez activated her backup beacon, transmitting additional evidence directly to news organizations and foreign intelligence services. That would have no incentive to suppress information about American biological weapons programs. If the American government was too corrupt to investigate its own crimes, then international pressure might force accountability through external channels. Colonel Hayes's voice returned to the communication system, carrying that tone of increased urgency. Captain, you're forcing me to escalate this situation beyond what either of us wants. My orders are to secure the witnesses and evidence by any means necessary. Surrender now, and you'll be treated as prisoners of war. Continue this resistance, and you'll be classified as enemy combatants. Sarah understood the threat. Enemy combatants could be killed without legal consequences, their deaths attributed to legitimate military action against terrorist threats. Colonel Hayes was offering her a choice between surrender and summary execution, confident that his authority and resources would protect him from any investigation. But Sarah had spent 18 months learning that authority and resources could be defeated by people who refused to be intimidated. She had survived impossible odds before, and she had something now that made her more dangerous than any special operations soldier. Absolute moral clarity about who deserved to win this fight. Colonel Hayes, she said calmly, I have a counter-proposal. You and your people have 60 seconds to withdraw from this location and surrender to federal authorities. If you refuse, you'll discover exactly why the Marine Corps gave me specialized training in demolitions and chemical warfare." The colonel's laugh carried clearly through the communication system. "Captain, you're in an abandoned missile silo surrounded by professional soldiers with air support. What exactly do you think you can accomplish with threats and bravado?" Sarah smiled as she activated the remote detonation system, her finger hovering over the trigger that would convert several hundred gallons of rocket fuel into a fireball visible from orbit. "Colonel, 18 months ago you made the mistake of assuming a Marine captain could be eliminated by bureaucratic manipulation. Tonight, you're making the mistake of assuming she can be eliminated by superior firepower." The communication system fell silent as Colonel Hayes realized the implications of Sarah's words. Through the silo surveillance systems, Dr. Martinez reported increased activity among the assault teams, soldiers receiving new orders and preparing for immediate action. The colonel had apparently decided that negotiation was more dangerous than the tactical risks of storming a fortified position. Sarah began counting down from 60, her voice carrying clearly through the communication system. The assault teams were moving faster now, abandoning systematic clearance procedures in favor of speed and overwhelming force. They had perhaps 4 minutes before the soldiers reached the lower levels where Sarah had prepared her improvised weapon. At 30 seconds, Colonel Hayes's voice returned to the communication system. "Captain Chen, you're bluffing. No Marine officer would detonate an explosive device that would kill innocent personnel and destroy evidence needed for prosecution." Sarah continued counting, her voice steady and implacable. At 15 seconds, she could hear boots pounding down the silo stairwells as the assault teams abandoned caution in favor of desperate speed. At 10 seconds, she could hear Colonel Hayes shouting orders to his pilots, probably preparing for immediate evacuation. At 5 seconds, Sarah's finger moved to the detonation trigger. At 0, Colonel Hayes's voice cut through the communication system with obvious panic. "All teams withdraw immediately. Repeat, all teams withdraw to minimum safe distance." Sarah held her position for another 30 seconds, listening to the sound of soldiers retreating with the same coordinated precision they had used to approach. Through the surveillance systems, she could see helicopters pulling back and ground vehicles moving away from the silo at high speed. Colonel Hayes had decided that eliminating witnesses wasn't worth the risk of being eliminated himself. But Sarah knew the withdrawal was only temporary. Colonel Hayes would regroup, develop new tactics, and return with whatever resources were necessary to complete his mission. The evidence transmission had bought them time, but it hadn't eliminated the threat or guaranteed their survival. Dr. Martinez monitored news broadcasts on her emergency beacon, tracking the initial reports. As major media outlets began analyzing the evidence they had transmitted, the story was too big and too well documented to suppress through normal channels. But Sarah knew that extraordinary situations sometimes produced extraordinary countermeasures. Within hours, government officials would be implementing damage control strategies that could include anything from discrediting the evidence to eliminating the witnesses. The biological weapons programs would be classified beyond public scrutiny. The conspiracy would be explained as national security operations, and Sarah and Dr. Martinez would be portrayed as foreign agents or domestic terrorists, unless they could reach legitimate authorities before the cover-up machinery had time to operate. Sarah's tactical assessment identified one possibility that offered hope for both survival and justice. The abandoned missile silo was connected to an underground communication network that had been designed to survive nuclear war. If the Cold War-era systems were still operational, they could potentially reach military commands that weren't part of Colonel Hayes's conspiracy. The communication equipment was located in the silo's deepest level, protected by multiple layers of reinforced concrete and electromagnetic shielding. Sarah and Dr. Martinez descended through maintenance passages that hadn't been used in decades. following schematic diagrams painted on the walls by engineers who had built these systems to outlast civilization itself. The communication center was exactly where the schematics indicated, filled with equipment that looked primitive compared to modern technology but had been built to standards that prioritized reliability over sophistication. Sarah found power switches and activation sequences, bringing the systems online with procedures that felt like archaeological excavation. The equipment responded sluggishly but functionally, connecting to satellite networks and military communication channels that bypassed normal routing systems. Sarah transmitted on emergency frequencies used by Special Operations Command, identifying herself with authentication codes that should still be valid despite her official death 18 months earlier. The response came from a voice she recognized. General Patricia Morrison, the commanding officer who had recruited Sarah for her undercover assignment. "Captain Chen, we've been monitoring reports of your death for the past 6 hours. Are you secure?" Sarah felt relief flooding through her as she realized legitimate military authority still existed within the system. General Morrison had been one of the few officers she trusted completely, someone whose integrity and competence had never been questioned during her military career. "General," Sarah said, "I'm secure but not safe. Colonel Hayes and elements of Fort Sterling's command structure are involved in a conspiracy to steal and sell biological weapons research. They've attacked their own facility and are attempting to eliminate witnesses to cover their crimes. We're aware of the situation. Captain, Dr. Martinez's evidence transmission reached us 40 minutes ago, and we've been coordinating with federal agencies to investigate the allegations. Colonel Hayes and his accomplices are about to discover that their authority doesn't extend to treason investigations." Through the silo surveillance systems, Sarah could see new aircraft approaching their position. But these helicopters carried different markings, federal law enforcement insignia, rather than military designations. FBI tactical teams, probably supported by military personnel who had maintained their loyalty to constitutional principles rather than profitable corruption. General Morrison's voice continued through the communication system. "Captain, you and Dr. Martinez are to consider yourselves under federal protection until this investigation is complete. The evidence you've provided has triggered the largest counterintelligence operation in military history." Sarah watched through the surveillance monitors as Colonel Hayes's forces found themselves surrounded by federal agents with superior numbers and legal authority. The corrupt soldiers who had attacked Fort Sterling were now facing arrest warrants issued by judges who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Justice was finally arriving, carried by people who still believed that military service meant protecting the Constitution rather than profiting from its violation. Colonel Hayes's voice returned to the communication system one final time, his tone carrying the defeated resignation of someone who realized his carefully constructed conspiracy was collapsing. "Captain Chen, you've won this engagement, but you should understand that this network extends far beyond Fort Sterling. Arresting me won't eliminate the threat." Sarah picked up the communication handset, feeling the satisfaction of someone who had spent 18 months preparing for this moment. "Colonel Hayes, you made one critical error when you decided to attack Fort Sterling and eliminate witnesses to your crimes." "What error was that, Captain?" "You assumed that a janitor was invisible because she was unimportant. But I was invisible because I was hunting, and tonight, the hunt is over." As federal agents moved through the silo to secure the witnesses and evidence, Sarah reflected on the 18 months she had spent mopping floors and being dismissed as irrelevant by people who considered themselves untouchable. The conspiracy had been exposed, the guilty would face justice, and the biological weapons research would remain destroyed. But more importantly, the principle that no one was above accountability had been preserved by people willing to sacrifice everything to defend it. The invisible janitor had become visible at exactly the right moment, reminding everyone that democracy's greatest strength was the willingness of ordinary citizens to become extraordinary when circumstances demanded it. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a federal courtroom watching Colonel Hayes and 17 co-conspirators receive sentences that would ensure they spent the rest of their lives contemplating the cost of betraying their country. The biological weapons programs had been permanently discontinued. The corrupt networks had been dismantled, and new oversight procedures had been implemented to prevent similar conspiracies. Dr. Martinez had been offered a position directing legitimate biological defense research under enhanced security protocols. She had accepted, but only after receiving guarantees that her work would never again be perverted into weapons that violated international law. Sarah had been offered promotion to full colonel and command of a new counterintelligence unit responsible for investigating corruption within military and intelligence agencies. She had accepted, understanding that the fight against internal enemies would require the same dedication and skills she had once applied to foreign threats. As she left the courthouse, Sarah thought about the lessons learned during 18 months of being invisible. Power corrupted, but accountability corrected. Authority could be abused, but citizens could resist. And sometimes the most dangerous person in any room was the one everyone assumed they could safely ignore. The janitor had finished her cleaning duties. Now Colonel Sarah Chen had new floors to mop and new enemies to hunt. And they would never see her coming until it was too late to escape the justice they had spent so long avoiding. The invisible woman had taught them all a lesson they would never forget. Underestimate the cleaning lady at your own peril. 2 years after the Fort Sterling incident, Sarah Chen walked through the marble corridors of the Pentagon with the confident stride of someone who had earned her place through blood and determination rather than politics and connections. The stars on her shoulders caught the morning light streaming through the windows, a tangible reminder of how far she had traveled from the woman who once pushed a mop bucket through hostile territory. The briefing room was filled with the kind of people who shaped national security policy from behind closed doors. Cabinet members, intelligence directors, military commanders who controlled budgets larger than most countries' entire economies. They turned as she entered, offering the respectful attention reserved for officers whose reputations preceded them into every room. General Patricia Morrison stood at the head of the conference table, her weathered face carrying the satisfaction of someone who had watched a protégé exceed every expectation. The PowerPoint presentation behind her displayed a world map dotted with red markers, each one representing a facility where Sarah's new counterintelligence unit had uncovered corruption, prevented attacks, or dismantled networks that threatened American interests. Ladies and gentlemen, General Morrison began, I present Brigadier General Sarah Chen, Director of the Internal Security Assessment Division. In the past 18 months, her unit has identified and neutralized 47 separate instances of internal threats across military and intelligence installations. Sarah took her position at the briefing podium, scanning the faces of people whose decisions affected millions of lives around the globe. These were individuals accustomed to wielding power without question, making choices that determined the fate of nations. But they were also people who had learned to respect results over rhetoric, effectiveness over political convenience. The Fort Sterling investigation revealed that internal threats represent a greater danger to national security than traditional foreign espionage. Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced those threats personally. Corrupt personnel with legitimate access can cause more damage than enemy agents operating from outside our institutions. She clicked through slides showing financial networks, communication intercepts, and organizational charts that mapped corruption reaching into every major government agency. The biological weapons conspiracy had been just the beginning, a single thread that had unraveled an entire tapestry of treachery, woven through decades of unchecked authority and insufficient oversight. Secretary of Defense Matthews leaned forward, his expression reflecting both admiration and concern. General Chen, your unit's success rate is unprecedented, but the scope of the problems you've identified suggests systemic failures at every level of our security apparatus. How do we address threats that are embedded in the very institutions designed to protect us? Sarah had anticipated the question, having grappled with its implications during countless sleepless nights since accepting command of the assessment division. By remembering that the strength of our institutions comes from the people who serve them, not the systems that protect them. When systems become corrupt, it takes individuals willing to risk everything to restore accountability. CIA Director Reynolds shuffled through a thick folder of classified reports. General, your methods are unorthodox to say the least. Placing operatives in custodial positions, service roles, administrative functions. Some critics suggest you're creating a surveillance state within our own government. Sarah smiled, remembering the 18 months she had spent being dismissed as unimportant by people who considered themselves untouchable. Director Reynolds, we're not surveilling loyal personnel. We're identifying individuals who believe their positions grant them immunity from the oaths they swore and the laws they're supposed to uphold. The room fell silent as the implications settled over officials who had grown comfortable with authority that was rarely questioned or challenged. Sarah understood their discomfort. Her unit represented a fundamental shift in how internal security was conceptualized and implemented, moving from passive monitoring to active infiltration of the networks that threatened American interests. From within, National Security Advisor Williams cleared her throat, breaking the uncomfortable silence. General Chen, can you provide specific examples of threats your unit has identified and neutralized? Sarah clicked to a new slide showing photographs of individuals in military uniforms and business suits. Senator Marcus Webb, who was selling classified intelligence committee briefings to foreign buyers through encrypted cryptocurrency transactions. Colonel David Park, who was recruiting special operations personnel for private military contractors serving hostile governments. Dr. Alana Rodriguez, who was modifying pharmaceutical research to create biological agents for terrorist organizations. Each case had required months of careful investigation, with Sarah's operatives embedded in positions where they could observe, document, and ultimately expose the corruption that flourished in environments where accountability had been replaced by professional courtesy and institutional loyalty. The pattern is consistent across all cases, Sarah continued. Individuals with legitimate access who believe their positions make them immune to consequences. They're enabled by systems that prioritize institutional reputation over individual accountability, creating environments where corruption becomes normalized rather than prosecuted. FBI Director Thompson raised his hand, his expression reflecting the frustration of someone whose agency had struggled with similar problems. General, how do you prevent your own operatives from becoming corrupted by the authority they're given? How do you maintain accountability within a unit that operates with minimal oversight? Sarah had wrestled with that question since accepting command, understanding that power corrupted, regardless of the intentions behind it. By ensuring that every operative understands they're expendable, including myself, we serve principles larger than our own careers or comfort. The moment any of us begins to believe we're indispensable is the moment we become part of the problem we're supposed to solve. General Morrison stepped forward, her voice carrying pride mixed with concern. General Chen's unit has achieved remarkable results, but we must acknowledge the risks inherent in their operations. When we task individuals with infiltrating corrupt networks, we risk losing them to the very corruption they're investigating. Sarah nodded, acknowledging the validity of the concern. That's why our operatives are rotated frequently, subjected to regular psychological evaluations, and required to maintain connections with personnel outside the intelligence community. We've learned that isolation breeds the kind of moral flexibility that enables corruption to flourish. The briefing continued for another hour, with officials asking detailed questions about operational procedures, legal authorities, and oversight. Mechanisms. Sarah answered each query with the precision of someone who had thought through every implication of the work her unit was conducting. As the meeting concluded, Secretary Matthews approached her with the expression of someone who recognized both opportunity and danger. "General Chen, your unit represents either the solution to our internal security problems or the beginning of a different kind of threat to democratic institutions. How do we ensure it remains the former?" Sarah met his gaze directly, understanding that her answer would determine not only her unit's future, but potentially the direction of American security policy for decades to come. By remembering that we serve the Constitution, not the government. By maintaining accountability to the people we protect, not the institutions we inhabit. And by ensuring that power always remains subject to the principles that justify its existence. 3 months after the Pentagon briefing, Sarah sat in a coffee shop in downtown Washington, reading news reports about the latest corruption scandal her unit had exposed. A defense contractor had been selling American military technology to Chinese intelligence services, using a network of retired officers who maintained security clearances despite having no legitimate need for access to classified information. The case had required 6 months of investigation, with one of Sarah's operatives working as a janitor in the contractor's offices while another posed as a consultant, specializing in international business development. The evidence they gathered had led to arrests, congressional hearings, and new legislation strengthening oversight of private companies with government contracts. Dr. Martinez approached her table, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose work was making a positive difference in the world. The biochemist had become one of Sarah's closest advisors, providing scientific expertise for investigations involving research facilities and technological development programs. "Another successful operation," Rebecca said, settling into the chair across from Sarah. "How many does that make this year?" 63 confirmed cases, Sarah replied, though she took no satisfaction in the number. Each case represented American personnel who had betrayed their oaths for money, power, or ideological conviction. Every investigation revealed another layer of corruption that had festered in environments where oversight was considered interference rather than accountability. Rebecca studied her friend's expression, recognizing the weight that came with responsibility for exposing betrayal within institutions that were supposed to serve the public good. "Do you ever regret accepting this assignment? Do you ever wish you could go back to being invisible?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about the 18 months she had spent mopping floors and being dismissed as irrelevant by people who considered themselves untouchable. Those months had taught her that invisibility was a choice rather than a condition, and that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who never saw threats coming until it was too late to defend against them. "Rebecca," she said finally, "I spent 18 months learning that the most important battles are often fought by people no one considers important enough to notice. This work is just an extension of that lesson, applied to threats that hide behind authority and respectability." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah's secure phone, which displayed an urgent message from her operations center. Another investigation was beginning, this one involving allegations that foreign intelligence services were recruiting American military personnel through social media platforms and online gaming networks. Sarah read the briefing summary, noting the sophistication of the recruitment techniques and the seniority of the personnel who had been compromised. The investigation would require operatives who could blend into online communities while maintaining the technical skills necessary to track digital communications across multiple platforms and jurisdictions. Rebecca noticed her friend's expression changing as she absorbed the new information. "Another case?" Sarah nodded, already thinking through the operational requirements and personnel assignments that would be necessary to infiltrate and expose the network. "This one's different. Not recruiting for money or ideology. They're identifying personnel with psychological vulnerabilities and exploiting them through targeted manipulation that takes months or years to achieve results. The implications were staggering. Foreign intelligence services were no longer limited to traditional recruitment methods that relied on financial incentives or ideological conversion. They were using advanced psychological profiling and social media manipulation to identify and exploit American personnel who might never consider themselves susceptible to foreign influence. Rebecca understood the significance immediately. If they can manipulate people without those people realizing they're being manipulated, how do you investigate something like that? Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar satisfaction of facing a challenge that would test every skill she had developed during her career. The same way we've always investigated threats that hide behind respectability and authority. We become invisible. We watch, we learn, and we strike when they least expect it. As they left the coffee shop, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from an invisible janitor to the director of one of the most sensitive intelligence units in the American government. The work was harder now, the stakes higher, and the enemies more sophisticated. But the fundamental principles remained unchanged: accountability, integrity, and the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for the greater good. The invisible woman had become visible, but she had never forgotten the lessons learned while mopping floors and listening to secrets. In a world where power corrupted and authority enabled betrayal, someone had to remain willing to clean up the mess left behind by people who believed themselves above consequences. Sarah Chen had found her calling in the space between visibility and invisibility, hunting enemies who hid behind the very institutions they were sworn to protect. And as long as such enemies existed, she would continue the work that had begun 18 months earlier with a mop bucket and the determination to serve something larger than herself. The cleaning never ended. It just moved to different floors. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.